For our 100th episode, join us as we walk from the flatlands of Flanders, the chalk downland of the Somme, the forests of Verdun, and close to the mountains of the Vosges, where the Western Front came to an end. Travel with us across the old front line. It's hard to believe that this is the 100th episode of the Old Front Line podcast. Wow, what an achievement. An achievement only really possible with your support by listening to this podcast. The thousands of you each week who listen in and download and then give your feedback by liking the podcast on one of the platforms, by tweeting what you think of it to me on Twitter, by making comments on the Facebook page or the podcast website. All of this is greatly appreciated, and it's incredible if I look back to when the podcast began in March 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. As I mentioned before, it had been my intention to launch some kind of podcast long before that, and I thought to myself, whenever would I get the opportunity to sit down and think about this and really put something out there? And if there is a benefit from that period, this is certainly it, the chance to think about what a podcast would be, what it would be about, and more importantly, to tell some of the stories that we've told over the course of what is now nearly 2 years. We're approaching nearly 500,000 downloads. And again, when I think about that, and this is the 100th episode, it is quite mind-blowing. And the community that we've built up through this is really a great bonus that I could never have predicted. Those of you who do interact, like I say, on social media or through the podcast website, or support the podcast directly through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, and the social evenings that we have, they're a really important part of it as well. The one that we had only just this last week with Simon Verdun talking about battlefield archaeology, conflict archaeology. Record numbers of you attended that, and we had a really interesting evening with some fascinating questions. And again, the other thing that kind of staggers me when I look at the statistics of the podcast is just what a multinational audience you all are. You're literally from all over the world. And I notice when a podcast goes out on a Saturday morning, by the time I get up, well over 1,000 of you from, I presume, from Australia, America, Canada, have already listened to it. And that is quite amazing. And I think that it's become one of the podcast strengths for me, this building of a community of like-minded people, which we are, with a common goal, which is to remember and understand the Great War. And with our connection to the battlefields, for each of us, that means something different. And it's always good on the social evenings that we have to hear your views of what you visit, how you visit it, and what you feel about those visits. This is a subject not owned by one person or a group or an organisation, but all of us. We have all got an investment in this one way or another, whether that's a personal connection through relatives who served, or just by visiting the old front line and getting what we get from it. And again, for each of us, that is a different thing. But for me, going forward, one of the pluses of bringing together a community of people interested in the Great War is what that means for the long-term future of these battlefields. And it's something that I've been discussing with various people over the course of the last few weeks. We're a kind of voice for these battlefields, and I think that's quite important, because when I go back to the early years when I visited the battlefields, there was no voice. We were just isolated individuals or small groups travelling out to the Somme or Flanders or Verdun or wherever it was. And so many things disappeared, so much was lost because there was no voice. And I'd like to think that not just ours in the community of the Old Frontline podcast, but the many other groups of like-minded communities that are out there post-pandemic, this is a time to work together and to see what we can do to move the Great War battlefields forward and ensure that they're never forgotten. When I look back over what we've covered already in the podcasts, a few people often ask me, am I going to run out of stories? Well, have spent my life talking about the Great War, so I hope that won't ever be the case. And I kind of find myself discovering new things all the time. I think it's one of the great things about this subject is it is so vast, and you find a new account, and you find a new book, and you discover a new photograph, and you research some information about a place that you've never come across before, and it opens up new doors, and that's what I like. It's forever evolving. So I hope we won't be running out of any content anytime soon. But looking back over what we've done, we've covered quite a lot of battlefields, key battlefields like Flanders and the Somme, and we will continue to do that. We've looked at areas of the forgotten fronts of the Great War on the Western Front, whether that's the forgotten front itself, places like Loos and Neuve-Chapelle, but we've gone off the beaten track to Arras and Cambrai. We've gone down into what is seen as the French sectors of the Western Front, like Verdun and the Chemin des Dames. And we've gone to Gallipoli as well, and we've looked at some key subjects, whether that's executions in the Great War with Shot at Dawn, whether it's what World War I trench warfare was all about, or most recently the podcast about food. Quite a lot of you contacted me to say that you'd never really thought about that before, and it threw up some interesting thoughts and challenges and ideas when the podcast came out and you had a chance to listen to it. So we will continue really going forward following that kind of theme, looking at history, looking at the battlefields, and going much further afield. So there's lots of subjects for us to cover, and lots of battlefronts that we haven't yet touched on, places like Mesopotamia and Palestine and Salonika, all of which going forward we will get to at some point. But I'm not in any kind of hurry, and I'm sure you aren't either. And this is something, the podcast, that I want to continue to do and to develop on it. Now, this year I'm hoping that we will have less interrupted travel to the battlefields of the Great War, and indeed generally, so that people can go about their lives, see family, and for those of us with an interest in the First World War, go back to our battlefields, visit some new battlefields, go across some new ground. And I hope that all of you listen to this, if you're in a position to do that, will get a chance to do so. But in terms of the podcasts, as I start to get back to the battlefields, I am going to develop another side to it, and that is the video side of it, the film side of it. With the kit that I've now got, I'm going to get out onto the battlefields and produce some short videos which are essentially visual versions of some of the podcasts that we've already done, and some new areas that we haven't yet touched on. And it'll just be me wandering around with a camera, talking about these locations, and hopefully shedding some light on places, and perhaps talking about objects and things that we see there in a way that the podcast can't always do. The visual side of it is important, and this won't replace the podcast, far from it, but it will be a way to add another level, another dimension to it. And that's something that I intend to, going forward, place onto the podcast YouTube channel. At the moment, I've put some of the podcasts on there. There's some old bits of film that I've taken over the years, but there will be hopefully a lot more new film going forward as we move throughout this year, and perhaps do some live online talks and then place those on the YouTube channel as well. And I think beyond that, what comes across when we have our social evenings, and if you've never had a chance to come to one of our social evenings and you are a Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon supporter, do try and come along sometime in the next couple of months. If you're not a supporter via those methods and you'd like to see what it's like, I am in the next few weeks going to be launching one, especially for people like yourself, so you can see what one of these evenings is all about. But one of the things that we often talk about in this, and one thing I think that comes across to me, is the desire for us not to just meet up in the virtual world, but in the real world as well, on the battlefields. And this is something, again, that I intend to develop with the podcast once it's clear that travel is indeed back to some kind of normality, whether that's a trip going across on a coach with leisure holidays, or whether it's a chance where we meet up and we walk a bit of the front line together, perhaps even both, who knows. But these are the sort of things that I'm thinking of as we move from this 100th episode towards the next 100 episodes of the Old Front Line. So what are we doing in this centenary episode then? I thought about doing a particular location, but I thought instead that we'll actually have 4 locations, so you get a bit of extra content, as it were, in terms of diversity this week. So we're going to start in Flanders, we're going to work our way down to the Somme, We'll visit Verdun along the way, and we'll end where the Western Front ended, close to the village of Perfetta House in the Vosges, right at the far end of the Western Front. So it'll be a little journey across the old front line, and hopefully tell a few tales and some interesting facts and stories along the way. So it's time to strap on our virtual boots, pick up our virtual pack, and head out across the battlefields of the Great War. In this walk across the old front line, we're going to roughly do it north to south. So we're starting up at the top end of the Western Front in Belgium, in Flanders, and then we'll head south down to the Somme, beyond to Verdun, and end in the Vosges. Where we're beginning is just outside the city of Ypres. Ypres, that main British battlefield of the Great War, 4 years of constant fighting, 4 major battles, a lot of other operations and smaller scale battles besides. Probably every regiment of the British Army passed through there at some point, all of the Commonwealth nations, and of course French, Belgian, American, and on the other side of no man's land, German soldiers as well. So this was one of the iconic parts of the Western Front, and a place that was one of the earliest points of battlefield pilgrimage when the war came to an end. Within a few months of the armistice, the Michelin Tire Company had published a battlefield guide to Ypres. People were already beginning to look at organised visits. Families were coming out to find graves or the field in Flanders where a loved one had died. And within another few months, as men became discharged from the army, their war service was over, they too began to come either on their own or in small groups, and eventually as you move into the 20s and 30s with the creation of regimental or divisional associations, or even army ones like the 5th Army Association that we mentioned in the previous podcast about Henry Williamson, those kind of organisations did trips as well. And Ypres really became, just as it was during the war, this bastion of the British Army, the British and Commonwealth forces on the Western Front. It became this symbolic location. And of course, one of the other reasons for that was its close proximity to the Channel ports. It was very easy to get to Ypres. In those days, most people came down from Ostend or Zeebrugge, but today we travel over from Calais, whether that's via the ferry or the tunnel. We can be in Ypres with just over an hour. It's very easy to get there, and that explains its ever-increasing numbers, even beyond the end of the Great War centenary, and hopefully those numbers will return post-COVID. But for Britain and the Commonwealth, 250,000 dead there during the 4 years of fighting. That's 1 in every 4 of those who died in the Great War, and 1 in every 3 of British and Commonwealth soldiers who fell on the Western Front fell at Ypres. It will always remain at the heart of remembrance travel, and our visits to these battlefields. Now, we're not going to try and walk around the whole Ypres salient in this episode. We're going to look at one particular place. So, where are we? Well, we're not out in the fields. We're not in the area just outside the Menin Gate or along the ramparts or walking down the Menin Road. We're in the middle of a modern industrial estate. So why are we here? Well, if you go back more than 20 years, this bit of ground just north of Ypres that runs in close proximity to the Yser Canal, that old medieval canal that was used to ship the barges of cloth from the centre of the European cloth trade in the Cloth Hall at Ypres up through the canal system to other canal systems to transport it across Europe. That canal became part of the front line close to the village of Bozing, or Bazingi, as the troops called it. And in the late 90s, that stretch of farmland had remained pretty much untouched since the Great War. It had been largely used for pasture land, was sold off and became a development zone, the creation of a commercial area where factories and small business units and warehouses were built. Now, at that time, professional archaeologists, qualified archaeologists, were not interested really in the Great War. A few were, but here in Flanders, they were interested in Roman or medieval or other periods. So back then, what we'd now describe as a form of conflict archaeology was done not by professionals, it was done by amateurs. There were a few little groups, the best known of which were the diggers. And the diggers had got official permission to carry out what is essentially rescue archaeology, working one step ahead of the construction works that were going on there to discover and record and recover whatever they found in their path. Now, a lot of locals had said to them, there won't be anything there. Everything was cleared up after the war, all the bodies were recovered, all the equipment was salvaged. There's going to be nothing. You're just going to find a few bits and pieces, perhaps a lot of live shells, and that'll be it. But what actually happened, and what it proved, is that the landscape of the Great War is the last witness of the Great War. Everything is still there. The trenches, the dugouts, the barbed wire, the equipment, the weapons, indeed lots of live munitions. And on top of that, far from all the dead having been recovered, what the diggers proved is there were many still lying in Flanders fields. Now, I was very lucky to know some of the diggers, Jackie Platou and Aurel Secou, and I got invited up to see some of the work that they were doing. And then they did a big display of the material that they'd found, a staggering array of Great War material. They put it on display in the old school in Vosges. And the BBC producer, John Hayes Fisher, came along and saw this, and that led to The Forgotten Battlefield, a BBC Meet the Ancestors documentary back in 2002. Now, there's an early episode of the podcast where we talk about this, and you can go back and listen to that episode, and also go onto YouTube and you'll find the Forgotten Battlefield documentary on there to watch as well, and probably have a giggle at a much younger version of me. But more importantly, you'll see people like Aurel Secou and Jackie Platou on there talking about what they were finding. It was an incredible period. Now, the reality of it is that it was rescue archaeology. What they were finding, these vast trench systems, German bunkers, British dugouts, it wouldn't be preserved. But it was clear, given the massive reaction to the documentary, that something must be preserved. And that's where we're standing now, in the middle of this industrial estate, with these big modern units around us. We're standing by a section of preserved First World War trench. This is Yorkshire Trench, so called because it was a section of trench dug and prepared by the men of the 49th West Riding Division. They were a Yorkshire Territorial Division with battalions of the Yorkshire Regiment, the Green Howards in it, the East Yorkshire Regiment and the York and Lancs, amongst others. And the York and Lancs battalions, recruited in Sheffield and Barnsley and Rotherham, served in this area for quite some months from 1915 on into 1916. And there was a Barnsley trench just down the road from Yorkshire Trench. So a lot of the trenches here had Yorkshire-connected names. When you come here today, this little oasis of the Great War, surrounded by the modern world, what you see is some gravel pathways, a wooden walkway, and a section of preserved trench. And the preserved trench was preserved with concrete sandbags, of which more in a moment. The pathways that you see, the wooden walkway, is not just a walkway, because if you look at it, it goes along in an irregular shape, then goes into a big circle, and then continues in an irregular shape. And what it is, as well as a walkway, it is a map of the French trench that the diggers found when they first excavated this site, because in 1915, at the end of the Second Battle of Ypres, the French had been thrown back here and they constructed the trench system. And what this was a French strong point. The circular bit was probably a machine gun or a mortar position, and a trench coming in either side. At some point, possibly because it wasn't a very good trench, the British had abandoned it, and the West Riding lads from Yorkshire had dug Yorkshire Trench. The gravel pathway, which is a lot straighter, and it's this kind of yellowy gravel that makes it stand out a little bit more. Again, this is not just a pathway, it's a map. Not of a trench this time, but a map of the tunnels which are about 30 feet beneath this site. Because when the diggers excavated this section of Yorkshire Trench, they found the two entrances to the British dugout system in this sector. And back in 2001, I was very lucky to have an opportunity to go down there, to walk down those original steps. You went about halfway down, and the ceiling came down very low, and you had to bend down to get underneath that. And that was done, we believe, to aid the defenders take on any attackers that got into the trench and tried to come down those dugout steps, because if you had to stoop to get under that bit, you were at that point vulnerable, and men could fire from below, stopping you getting any further. And it would probably also prevent the Germans just tossing a grenade down there, because when it went off, it would go off on that level rather than come all the way down to the bottom. But going down those steps, there was Flanders mud, the blue clay mud everywhere. It got under your fingertips, it got up your nose, it got in your ears, it got in your eyes. And even when I went to a modern hotel that night and had a shower, I still really couldn't get rid of it. And it made me think what it must have been like for those lads to kind of live in those conditions. But when you went down into the bottom section of it and you saw the different rooms that had been used for different purposes as headquarters, billets, workshop area, there was still quite a lot of water that you had to wade through. The pumps, the modern pumps that the diggers had, were working night and day to keep this water out. And again, it makes you think about the war where they were using hand pumps. They couldn't use mechanical pumps because of the noise they made. It would attract the attention of the enemy. So all the water was pumped out by hand. And here they were using modern petrol-powered pumps, and even they struggled to keep the water from returning. But in that water level at the bottom of the dugout, there was a kind of silty level in there as well, which had preserved a huge amount of material. So bits of uniforms, socks, personal equipment, wooden boxes, even bits of paper came out of this. So it was a great preserver. And a lot of this material is now on display in the Flanders Fields Museum at Ypres. There's a special diggers display where you can see some video of what this dugout system beneath Yorkshire Trench looked like, and see some of the artefacts that were recovered from this amazing time capsule of the Great War. And the good thing is that you can then connect all that to the landscape here, because here is that little bit of trench preserved, and the mapping of the original French trench and the mapping of the tunnels beneath. All of it kind of comes together, and with information panels showing some of the archaeological work and some photographs of the remains of the soldiers that were found here. And it wasn't just British soldiers. They found a lot in no man's land. Quite a lot of men from the West Riding Division who died in the July 1915 battle, for example. But they found German soldiers and French soldiers as well, and some later casualties from the 38th Welsh Division, Royal Welsh Fusilier soldiers. And we spoke about that in the previous podcast. But when you come here now, and this was a Yorkshire Trench, a location that we visit on our Ledger Battlefield tours on a regular basis, because it's good to show the different ways in which trenches have been preserved. So in Flanders, Sanctuary Woods, with the trenches left as they were and being these kind of muddy ditches, the reconstructed ones at places like the Memorial Museum at Passchendaele at Zonnebeek, or at Nick's at Hoog Crater, the trenches he's got there, and then come to this to see something that's been preserved in concrete. Now, it was a good job when it was done at the time, and what you do when you come into the site is you go down some little steps into the trench, and you can walk an entire length of it. You can see where the two dugout entrances were. They're still under there, the dugouts. There's concrete, I think, in there now to stop any subsidence, but they put a grill across it so you can see the water and a bit of the timber. And then you come out the other side, and it gives you an idea of, I think, this kind of claustrophobic aspects of trenches of the Great War, and what a fighting trench like this looked like. But, and this is the but, now it's falling into disrepair, and a lot of the concreted sandbags have come away, fallen in, and this whole section of the trench that you just can't walk in. But of course, with COVID, no one has been coming here in any great numbers to really notice this. There's been information about these problems on the internet. We've seen this on and off over a couple of years, but there is a gradual process beginning now as we emerge from the period in which people couldn't visit the battlefields, where there is a process to start renovations at this site, which will of course cost money, and there are organisations trying to raise money for this. And this is something I hope we're going to look at in a future podcast. Yes, I'm promising a future podcast again. But I wanted to mention this because I think one of the points of us coming here to Yorkshire Trench to make you think about visiting that site and connecting it to what's in the Flanders Fields Museum, that gives you an idea for a future visit. But it's also one of the key elements of what this podcast is about, is the Great War landscape as it is today. And that landscape is organic, it changes. And going back to what we were talking about with community, I think this is a good example of where the voices of those with a vested interest and a connection to that Great War landscape can step in and help. But more of that again soon, and for now we'll step away from Flanders and head down to the rolling chalk downlands of the Somme. The theme in this podcast, which I'm sure you'll see as we go on, is the Great War landscape and how we connect to it and what it means to us. And one of the ways for me to connect to it is through the veterans of the Great War, whether that's a personal account that I've read or is in an archive, or whether it's a veteran that I had the opportunity to meet and interview back in the 1980s and 90s. And one of those that I've been thinking of recently as I dug up some of the papers from him from when I went to see him was a chap called Aubrey Rose. He served with the 1st 16th London Regiment, the Queen's Westminster Rifles in the 56th London Division. And how did I find, and I've talked about this a little bit in the podcast before, but how did I find men like him? Well, in his case, he was one of those interviewed by Martin Middlebrook for his book, First Day on the Somme. And at the back of that book is a list of the veterans that contributed to his research. He didn't quote every single one of them. He sent many of them just a questionnaire with different questions about what they did and what they saw. And if there was any that he felt deserved a follow-up with a proper interview, he would go and see them or get someone to do that for him. And someone had been to see Aubrey. When I went to actually see him eventually, I discovered that he'd never met Martin Middlebrook. It was one of his researchers who'd come to interview him. Anyway, how I found him was in the back of the book, there's a list of all these veterans, and for some reason that even Martin himself has never really been able to tell me, he put where they were living at the time that he interviewed them in brackets behind their name. So as I was living in Sussex then, I looked up the ones who he had listed living in places in Sussex in the phone book. And having looked them up with the phone book, I gave them a call, and if they were up for it, I would then go and see them. Now, some of them I called and they weren't really interested in talking or having a little chat with them. I wasn't sure that I was going to get much from them. But there were others where we'd talk quite easily for about half an hour, and it was clear that I was going to get quite a lot from them, so I'd go and interview them. So Aubrey lived down in Hove in a retirement flat with his wife, and I went down to see him. And I went down a few times, and one time I went with my dad. Being a World War II veteran, he was often interested to meet these old boys. But my dad was from the East End of London. Aubrey Rose was a Jewish lad from London, and they had a lot of parts of the old city in common. So it was a different kind of conversation, that one, but an interesting one nevertheless. So going down to see him that first time, how would I get as much as I could from him? Well, I'm not saying that I was perfect at this, as I'm sure people like Richard Van Emden will tell you. It was an evolving process. You learn every time you went to interview a veteran, you learned something from the actual process of doing it. The right buttons to press, what they were, for example. And one of the things that I found that they often kind of reacted to in a good way was that I had this knowledge in my head of where things were on the Western Front. So when they talked about locations, I could say to them, well, oh yes, that was next to this place. And they would kind of look at you quite surprised that you even knew what these places were, let alone where they were. And it would make them kind of feel at ease. And I'd talk about units that were in their division. And gradually, I suppose, I began to kind of talk their language in a way. And they responded to that. And they opened up to that. And they told me a lot about their war. And it was rare to do that in one visit. It would take several visits in the case of what I would call the really good veterans. But it makes me realise how lucky I was to even have this experience, and what an extraordinary experience it was. And as I've said, I think before on this podcast, I do hope that the men themselves, the veterans themselves, got something from it. Aubrey's wife, I remember, was not keen on him going back to the Great War in his mind because it had been a difficult time for him. But I think even she recognised that the way he was able to verbalise some of the things that he'd gone through was helpful. So what was his story? Well, he'd gone out to the Western Front and he'd served with the Queen's Westminster Rifles at different parts of the line, particularly in Flanders. And then that battalion had joined the newly created or recreated 56th London Division. It was the original 1st London Division that had been formed before the war from different London battalions and had been brought back together in France to form the 56th Division. And they were then preparing for the first day of the Somme, the attack on the Somme on the 1st of July. The sector they were given was around the village of Hebuterne, facing the German positions at Gommecourt Park and Gommecourt Village. And it's the attack on Gommecourt which strictly speaking, is in the Pas-de-Calais rather than the Somme, but from a British perspective, it's part of the Somme battlefields. And it was good to stay there. One of the things that's kind of made me think about Albury again is that I stayed there with my old pal Andrew back in December when we were on the Western Front before Christmas. And it made me think about the veterans that I'd known who served in that part of the battlefield. So this northern part of the Somme, which was not part of the main attack, it was a diversionary attack. Aubrey's division and their neighbouring division, the 46th North Midland Division, were to attack the village of Gommecourt from different sides, draw the Germans' attention into that area and away from the main northern area of advance on the Somme, which was close to the village of Serres, where the POWs battalions from Barnsley and Bradford, Leeds and Sheffield and so on, where they were attacking. And essentially, as I think pretty much Aubrey Rose put himself, their job was to get shot at by the Germans. Their job was to attract the attention of the Germans. Their job was to bring as many Germans into that area as possible. And what the divisional commander, Major General Hull, did was to dig assembly trenches in broad daylight. The Middlesex lads lost quite a few casualties in doing that, and then he sent his assault in. Now, the London Division attack, these were experienced troops. Many of them had seen action at earlier periods in the war. It went forward with a good barrage. The assembly trenches that they dug reduced the distance across no man's land that they had to advance over, and they got into the German lines. Aubrey Rose was a runner. He was a runner to his company commander, Captain Hugh Fenwick Mott. Now, as a runner, his work has been immortalised recently in the film 1917, and again, you can go back through the podcast episodes to find one where we discuss that film. But as a company runner, it was his job to take messages from his officer to battalion headquarters, to officers from other companies, or relay messages from them to his company commander. And in the attack on Gommecourt, he went forward with Captain Mott, and they got close to the German lines. And he was given a message at one point to take it back, and he returned to his company commander, and when he got back to see him, he had been killed by a shell burst. He was lying there in no man's land close to the German trenches, and his batman was by his side when a shell landed close by, and they were killed outright. When the dust settled, there was nothing left of them. Captain Hugh Fenwick Mott is commemorated today on the Thiepval Memorial. I've never discovered the name of his batman. There's a very good website about Dorking and the Great War by Dorking Museum, and Hugh Fenwick Mott is listed on there. Aubrey Rose had a photograph of him, and there's another one that I've never seen before on this Dorking website, and what we discover about him on there is that he was born in Reigate in 1894, he'd gone to Marlborough College, and then he enlisted from Oxford University in 1914 straight into the Queen's Westminster Rifles. He went to France with them in early 1915 and was awarded a military cross for bravery at Hooge in the fighting there. And it's nice to see on that website that there are relatives of Captain Mott who have taken an interest in him and visited the battlefield, so that's a good thing. Now, I think how Aubrey had the portrait photograph of Captain Mott was because he went to see the Mott family after he'd recovered from his wounds here to give them the information as to how their son had been killed, always a very difficult task, and they'd given him a photograph, a lovely one, on card, I would guess as a memento of that. Now, with his company commander killed, his job as a runner wasn't over. He was now carrying messages for whoever was the new company commander. One of the lieutenants, no doubt, had been given a battlefield promotion and he'd taken over. And at one point he told me he was running across no man's land with one of these messages when the shock of seeing his officer killed hit him full on, and he just dropped to his knees with the battle going on around him, and he just burst into tears, uncontrollable tears, and stayed like that for a long time until he realised how precarious his position was there in the midst of a battlefield, broad daylight, with the enemy still shooting in every direction. So he picked himself up, carried on with his message, and took it into the British lines. When he handed it to the officer there, he said, "Do you want me to take a message back to the men in the trenches, in the German trenches where they're still fighting?" And he was told strictly not to go. "We're not sending any more men over. You're to stay here." So he remained there for the rest of the day, pretty much inactive with nothing to do, until he was told to head back to the other side of the village of Hebuterne to go and join the remnants of his battalion. And as he was making his way through the communication trench, a German shrapnel shell exploded above it, and a load of shrapnel balls came down through the back of his webbing equipment, through the back of his tunic, and wounded him very badly. He was put on a stretcher, taken down by some stretcher bearers into the village of Hebuterne. By this time the Germans were shelling the village. I guess they knew there was a concentration of British troops going on, and the main square, which was called Shell Green, was being shelled, and Aubrey was being taken across that on a stretcher when some shells dropped close by the stretcher bearers who were carrying him, and they panicked and they dropped the stretcher from waist high down onto the ground. Now you can imagine, with a back injury riddled with shrapnel balls, that was not a very nice thing to have happened to you, to say the least. And he passed out at that point. And really after that he went in and out of consciousness. What happened to him was that he was taken to an aid post, evacuated to a casualty clearing station, and then taken by a hospital train to the coast, to a coastal hospital. And there he was treated for his wounds. Now he was totally unconscious throughout this, and he had some very, very vivid dreams. And one of those dreams was that he was in some kind of mansion house, that's how he described it, and he was being led along the corridors of this, dressed in his army uniform, by a cloaked figure to a door, and that door was opened, and he went into a big long room, and in that room was a long table, and at the far end of that table was another cloaked figure sitting at the table with a huge ledger, beautifully bound ledger with handmade paper laid out, and that figure was writing something with a quill pen into the ledger. So Aubrey, having been beckoned forward by the other figure who accompanied him, walked into the room on his own, walked along that long table to the far end where the cloaked figure was writing, and stood behind him over one of his shoulders and looked down, and could see that he was writing the names of men from Aubrey's regiment who'd been killed in the attack at Gommecourt. And then the next line he began to write, Rifleman Aubrey Rose. And at that point Aubrey woke up, and staring at him was a nurse, an army nurse, and he'd survived. The wound he took at Gommecourt was so serious that was his war over. He was discharged the following year with a Silver War badge and went back to civvy life in London. I interviewed him in 84, 85, and he lived for quite a few years after that. So a long life after that almost fatal wound at Gommecourt in 1916. Today on the battlefields I can think of him, and so many the comrades of his who didn't survive, like Captain Mott, by starting in the village of Hebuterne and walking out on the road that would take you to Rossignol Woods, Nightingale Wood, Copse 125 as Ernst Junger called it, and it takes you out of the village to the eastern side of Hebuterne, to the area where there's some sunken roads going off to your right and the road bends, and ahead of you in the valley to the left is the Gommecourt Cemetery, where so many of the London Regiment men who were killed on the 1st of July are buried. And as you come out of there, you're looking across that ground with the southern edge of Gommecourt Park to your left, the village of Gommecourt behind it, and a civilian cemetery close to where there'd been a farm during the war. And it's somewhere in the trenches just towards us from there is where the men of the 16th London Regiment, including Aubrey Rose, got into the German lines. One of the stories he told actually was when they were going through the dugouts in those trenches, one of his mates wanted to get a Pickelhaube, a German spiked helmet, as a war trophy, and they'd been told not to touch anything, but he went down in one of the dugouts and there was a Pickelhaube on a table. He went straight to it, grabbed the spike and picked it up, and didn't realise there was a piece of wire coming from underneath it that was connected to a grenade underneath the table, and as he pulled the helmet up, it pulled the pin out the grenade, and the grenade exploded, killing him instantaneously. So that's where that battle was going on. It was somewhere from there that he was then sent back with a message, and where he dropped in no man's land, probably close to where the British cemetery is today, and dropped to his knees and cried over the death of his officer. The body of Captain Mott was never found, possibly because of those circumstances that Aubrey witnessed, with the shell exploding close by and killing his batman as he tried to take his officer's papers out of his pocket to be sent home. But there are plenty of unknowns in the cemetery here. And again, this is, like I say, is part of the power of these places. We can read the account of a veteran, we can read a memoir, we can read a bit of poetry or a piece of fiction, and we can connect that to a bit of the landscape and stand in places like this, a field in the middle of nowhere, close to the village of Gommecourt on the Somme battlefields. We've moved further down the Western Front now, and we're in the forests that surround the city of Verdun, where the Battle of Verdun took place in 1916. This was the longest battle of the Great War. It was fought over 300 days and 300 nights from February to December of 1916. More than 770,000 French and German soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in the battle, and it's estimated that in some areas as many as 1,000 shells per square metre fell. It turned this battlefield into a moonscape, perhaps almost unlike any other, except perhaps Passchendaele. And so symbolic was Verdun after the war, and so smashed was this ground here where the fighting had taken place, that the decision was made not to rebuild the villages here, and they became part of the long list of lost villages that were never rebuilt in parts of France after the Great War. A forest was planted, not to hide the battlefield, but to preserve it, as a warning perhaps for future generations. And with the construction of buildings like the ossuary at Douaumont, containing the bones of over 120,000 soldiers of both sides who fell and were recovered after the war, that too was a warning. Visiting Verdun for me is unlike almost any other battlefield of the Great War. There's a power to it, a different kind of power when you walk amongst the trees and you see the trenches and the shell holes. And when I first went there in 1987, we stopped the car, we got out, we walked just a few yards into the forest, and it wasn't just the remains of the battlefield that we saw, but the material remains too. The shell holes were then full of mess tins, water bottles, German Stahlhelm, French Adrienne helmets, barbed wire pickets, and rolls of barbed wire. The detritus of war was everywhere, and over the years since, as I've walked that battlefield extensively, I've found places where it's almost as if the war has remained intact in terms of the evidence of it. Places where, for example, I found a location where German soldiers had bivouacked before moving up to the front line, and their rubbish, their bottles, their tins, their broken mess equipment was scattered all over the place, just as if they'd left a few days before. It's an extraordinary battlefield, and when most people go there, they quite rightly go into what the French call le cœur de Verdun, the heart of Verdun, which is the area around Fleury, Fort Vaux, Fort Douaumont, and the ossuary at Douaumont and the Trench of Bayonets. That's on the right bank of the battlefield, a battlefield cut by the river Meuse. The left bank is less visited, and it's that left bank, the high ground around two key features of Morthomme and Côte 304, that we're going to visit here, or specifically Côte 304. This area of high grounds was an area of these two twin peaks, if you like. High ground, as we know from studying any battlefield, is all important. Whoever commands it commands that bit of ground. And as the Battle of Verdun began in February and the Germans pushed the French back towards the city of Verdun, it left an imbalance on this western side of the river Meuse. So in March the Germans attacked here, and throughout March and on into April, and then by May, gradually they fought their way across these twin peaks, and the ground around Morthomme and Côte 304 was taken. But that wasn't the end of the story. Fighting continued, and in 1917, a forgotten year really at Verdun, fighting returned to this ground once more, with a German attack in June and then a French response in August. And this is a part of the battle that's been written about in recent times by Christina Holstein, and I'll put reference to a couple of her books covering both this left bank area and that later fighting onto the podcast website. Christina Holstein knows the battlefields around Verdun like no one else I've ever met, and I've been lucky to walk that ground with her over the years. And if you've never come across or had a chance to look up her books on the subject, then I'd thoroughly recommend them. But this part of the Verdun battlefield saw tremendous casualties on both sides. When you read some of the accounts of the fighting around Côte 304, it talks about almost this constant bombardment going on. the gun smoke of battle hanging over the landscape, creating this ominous appearance as troops moved up to take part. Unit after French unit, unit after German unit fought their way through this ground. It was all part of that meat grinder, that mincing machine that Verdun became to the troops who served there in 1916. And to get up to the high ground of Côte 304, Côte 304, we're going to take a little journey from the village of Esnes-en-Argonne. Now, these little villages on this west bank, although completely destroyed in the Great War, they were rebuilt in a similar style, and they almost feel timeless to me. So you head up through these villages, and you can imagine them being part of the rear echelon of the French lines here, tired lines of poilus marching up these roads past the shattered buildings and the farms, heading up towards the front line, the ever-present sound of the bombardment ahead, and that gun smoke, like I said, hanging over the battlefield. And we'll take a climbing road, a winding road that takes us up the high ground. When you take this journey, and I've done it many times, both in a car and also on a coach with leisure groups, you can see the sense of this rising ground as you proceed. And across to your left, you can see quite a large French cemetery with dead from the fighting here, both in 1916 and 17. As we come up onto the crest of the high ground, this is all forested as well. It's a wooded area, and a road goes off to our right, and we take that road, a dead straight road that leads us to the very crest of Côte 304. As we move along it, we can begin to see the traces of war. The landscape here is very different to the open fields that we've passed on our way up from Esnes-en-Argonne. Here, the remains of the war are ever present. It's changed a little bit over the years that I've been visiting. Some of these areas have been reforested, so the trees were chopped down, the ground was then cleared and trees replanted. And what that does, unfortunately, at ground level is pretty much destroy the evidence of the Great War. The trenches disappear, the shell holes disappear. But what it also does, when they turn the ground over, the material from the war is exposed, live munitions, and also the bodies of French and German soldiers. And a large number are always being recovered here from this process. And one year I came here, and just to the south side of the very crest of Côte 304, they'd cleared that area, and there were human bones visible all over the place. The nature of total warfare, industrial warfare, when shells are pummeling the ground, destroying positions and destroying human life along with it. But also, again, the detritus of war. Water bottles, bits of Lebel rifles, German bayonets. It was just about everywhere. And unfortunately, there is no kind of archaeology that takes place when that happens. So a lot of this stuff is lost. It ends up in the hands of collectors, and it's totally forbidden to pick up items from the Verdun battlefield or go searching for them, particularly with a metal detector. And quite a few people have fallen foul of that over the years. Part of it is because of the danger of munitions. This is an area that was never properly cleared after the war, and a lot is lying in the surface level. So even when trees come down, it exposes things, let alone the clearance of whole areas. And a lot of collectors of live munitions, and believe me, there are some crazy people out there who do this, come here. And there was a German father and son I used to see very often in this area when I came here with leisure groups. Always kept a safe distance from them because I knew what they were up to. And then a few months later, I was talking to a Frenchman I knew in Verdun who said what had happened is they'd been searching up on the battlefield near Somme, just down the road from where we are at Côte 304, and had found some large caliber German shells, were loading them into the boot of their car, dropped it nose down onto tarmac, the shell exploded, and they were killed instantly. Now, this really just, exposes and explains the dangers of this kind of stuff. But at Verdun, to France, this is sacred ground. And the forest wardens who patrol this area are pretty strict when it comes to this sort of stuff. I've been walking quite legitimately deep in the forest, come across a forest ranger who's asked me a lot of questions. What are you doing there? Have you picked anything up? And of course, I've explained my intentions, got out my trench maps. I had shown them that what I was doing was looking at the landscape, not digging at the landscape. And that is an important thing to think about when you go there. But coming back to where we are at Côte 304, as we come across along that straight road to the very crest of the ridge, there's like a little roundabout, really, where a circular area with the memorial to the fighting that took place here that commemorates the units that took part in the operations around Côte 304, and that rightly records that this battlefield alone saw the sacrifice of over 10,000 French soldiers here, 10,000 poilus killed in action for the fighting around the crest of Côte 304. So when we talk about places that we know well on the British sector of the front, Hill 60, High Wood, we know these are places that were costly, but there were places like this too along the French sector, and for the Germans the same, no doubt. And what we see here, aside from the main memorial, are some unit memorials, and also, which is very typical of the Verdun battlefield, an isolated grave just by where you pull up in your car or your coach. You can see it, and that grave is of Georges François Joseph Fabre. He was from the 3e Zouaves, 3rd Regiment of Zouaves, killed in action in the fighting on Côte 304 on the 18th of May 1916. He was born in 1876 and came from the Drôme area of France. Now, his family would have had the option of having his remains, his field grave, moved from here to a French National Cemetery, either one of the ones close by, or the main ossuary, the cemetery in front of the ossuary at Douaumont, or repatriated back home to the family grave where they came from in the Drôme. But here at Verdun, and indeed on other parts of the French sector of the Western Front, it is very common to find these field graves still in existence. Families wanted to keep a loved one buried where they'd fallen. And this was something that happened on the British front. A lot of families wanted that too. The Imperial War Graves Commission decided that that wouldn't be the case. There are some exceptions to that, but that wouldn't be the case. They would move the graves, isolated graves, into main military cemeteries. But the French allowed this to happen. So as you walk around this battlefield, you come across graves like this. Field graves, places where men were originally buried, and they're still buried there more than a century later. So again, it's that uniqueness really to the Verdun battlefield. As you're walking it, as you're exploring it, you come across small memorials, you come across private monuments to individuals, sometimes just a cross in the forest, others more permanent memorials, and then field graves like this. France lost 1.4 million men in the Great War. It was an event that France really in the 20th century never properly recovered from. And you see the expression of that grief, the expression of that mourning in all sorts of ways here on the Verdun battlefield. But when you walk past Lieutenant Fabre's grave and you go into the next bit of forest, the trench remains there are very, very visible. And when I come here with groups or come on my own, this is an area I always like to walk into. Back in the early spring of 2016, in the approach to the centenary of the Battle of Verdun, I came here on a battlefield recce with some of my fellow battlefield guides to get ready for the tours that we were going to be doing around Verdun that year. It was a bright spring morning. There'd been some snow, and as I walked into the trenches here, there were faint spots of that snow all around the parapets and the parados and the shell holes, almost like an artist had picked them out and made them more visible. And as I turned and looked through the trees, the winter sun was beaming through, that ancient sunlight, as Henry Williamson called it, who we talked about in our previous podcast. I think of that phrase of his quite a lot when I walk the battlefields and see how the old sun lights up that world from more than a century ago. But standing there in that bit of the Verdun forest, looking through those trenches and the shell holes and the trees and the sun gleaming through, I pulled my camera out and took a photograph, and I've put that photograph as the key image for this podcast page on the podcast website. And when I took it and looked back on it that evening, it's one of the most satisfying photographs that I've ever taken. For me, it kind of encapsulates what the Verdun battlefield, in some respects, what the whole Old Front line is about. And it's interesting how things influence you, because when I looked at it again, I thought, I've seen this before. And then I thought of where I had seen it, on the walls of the Imperial War Museum many years ago, because I'd captured, albeit slightly unknowingly, or perhaps it was deep in my subconscious, I'd captured a similar view to Paul Nash's We Are Making a New World, a fantastic piece of war art that he painted in 1918 that shows a smashed landscape, stumped trees, and the sun shining through. And it just shows, I think, how so many aspects of the Great War can have an influence on you, can make you think and make you look in a way that perhaps you haven't looked before. And when you walk the ground like this, across these landscapes, you see them, even if momentarily it's subconscious. You see them through the prism of the books that you've read, the photographs that you've looked at, the art that you've stood in front of. And again, to me, particularly here at Verdun, in these trees around Côte 304, this again is all part of the power of the landscape of the Great War. Continuing our journey along the Western Front, we've moved from Verdun past the Saint-Mihiel salient, across to Nancy, and then beyond the rolling ground there to the mountains of the Vosges, and up over the mountains down into the flat plain below, we've come to the village of House. This is where the Western Front came to an end. It's only a small village, and it does retain some of its original buildings that were here at the time of the Great War. There was fighting here in the initial stages of the conflict, but otherwise it really became a quiet sector of the front, as much as any sector of the front was ever truly quiet. And it was here that the complex borders of 1914 came together, because after the Franco-Prussian War, you'll remember, the Germans annexed Alsace-Lorraine. So areas of this part of eastern France were actually Germany in 1914. And it's forgotten sometimes that there was fighting on what was then German soil. House was in France, but to its south was the border with Switzerland, and to its east was the border with Germany. So three borders met at a position now referred to at the 0 kilometre, kilometre zero, which, depending on how you look at it, is either the beginning or the end of the Western Front, snaking as it does from here along 450 miles of France and Belgium up to the Channel coast. Following the war of movement in 1914, when both sides dug in and the trenches of the Western Front were dug, this was the southern end of that front. It could go no further because Switzerland was a neutral country, and the trenches from Germany and from France could not continue across that border, and the Swiss made that pretty clear. They had their own army stationed on this part of the front to stop any incursions from either the French or the Germans. Now, there are positions just south of the village that are quite well known where you can do some really fantastic then and now photographs. There's a border point with Switzerland, and the building that was there during the Great War is still there, looking a bit more modern these days, but it is still there, and you can do some then and now photographs with pictures of French poilus standing there with Swiss border guards in the background. That's not where we're going today. We're going to go east of House, follow our way out of the village into a wooded area. We come to a lake on the right-hand side, and the road bends round, and this brings us up to the frontline sector, the final frontline sector on this part of the Western Front. Just over to our left, just off this road, are some quite large concrete bunkers which you can reasonably safely explore. It's always worth being extremely careful if you ever go into these things, because you may be stepping on earth, but you don't know if there's a big void beneath that earth, and you don't want to be disappearing down there. So always be careful when you go to these areas. But we're going to continue along the road. It bends round and it gets to another bit of road where a track goes off to the right through the trees, and we'll follow that track, and we're positioning ourselves now behind the German front line. The track runs roughly parallel, and you drop down from the track through the trees, and you can see the shapes of the trenches here. They're not as defined as they are in some of the forests close to here or up at Verdun, but you can see the shape of trench positions here. But more importantly, you can see quite a large German bunker, and I'll put a photograph of this on the podcast website. It's an observation bunker, it's not a fighting bunker, and a local association has done some renovations here, so there's steps going down into it, and you can safely go inside, and you can sit there looking out through its observation slits. Now, this is not the very end point of the front. You can continue following the track that you've just come off of deeper into the forest, getting nearer to the Swiss border, and you will come very close to the actual end. There's nothing physically kind of marking that, but you come to a point where essentially in 1914-18 the trenches ran out. And some years ago I was exploring that area, and there is a flat-topped bunker, probably a signals or a headquarters bunker a little bit further down there, and there were some strands of barbed wire that were lying on the top of it. And I picked one of these up, and I was thinking to myself that, this is the barbed wire of the end of the Western Front. Quite a significant object, really. But going back to the observation bunker, I've often taken groups here when we've done our Western Front end-to-end tour, where we travel the whole length of the Western Front, and I've come here myself on quite a few trips, and sitting in this bunker thinking, here you are, depending how you look at it, at the beginning or the end of the front, certainly from my point of view, in the kind of journeys that I've made, this is the kind of end point of a visit along the entire Western Front. And sitting there thinking that, as I look to my right, there is that vast swathe of 450 miles of the Western Front, so many different and differing battlefields and battlescapes, landscapes that change from mountains with snow, from craggy rocks through to thick forests where you find the remains of the trenches of the Great War and the mine craters and the shell holes, through to the flat, open plains and the dusty chalklands of the Champagne east of Reims, up through the farmland of northern France, across the canals near St. Quentin, and up into the chalk downlands of the Somme, and then the flat industrial landscape around Lens and Luz and the Forgotten Front, taking us into Flanders, where the flat fields of the Flanders Plain, the wet Flanders Plain, take us to the end of the Western Front, close to Newport, where both sides' trenches stops on the sandy shores of the Channel coast. That long and differing landscape, even a century later, more than a century later, still has so much to tell us. We have so much to learn by walking that ground. But more than that, it was a landscape that ended lives, changed lives forever. And we think of those human stories as we walk this ground, and sitting here in this bunker, it's almost like it's echoing to the voices of all those soldiers, whether it's the memoirs we've read or when I think of the veterans that I knew. But sitting here in this bunker at the end of the front, this is where it all seems to come together, the criss-cross paths of the Great War. Its journey's end in some ways, but in others, it's just the beginning, the start of a new path along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcore. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.